Welcome back. Listen to any of Robert Mugabe's campaign speeches and you'll hear a continuing refrain, that of Britain, the West, and their apparent desire to meddle in Zimbabwean politics. In this half of the program, we're going to explore that idea, trying to find out if it's fact, fiction, or perhaps somewhere in between. But first, it is worth pointing out that as much as Mugabe sees Britain as a threat, Britain itself has made the Zimbabwean situation very much its own business, 28 years after it relinquished power there.
We will seek to impose travel and financial sanctions on those in the inner circle of the criminal cabal running the regime. The House knows that since the Council met last week, the situation has deteriorated further still. As a number of African presidents and ministers have already stated, the regime has made it impossible to hold free and fair elections in Zimbabwe, and state-sponsored terror and intimidation has put the opposition in an untenable position. Our thoughts are with the people of Zimbabwe, who are facing an unprecedented level of violence and intimidation from the regime.
Still with us, our guests in London, George Shire, Zimbabwean political analyst, in Johannesburg, Roy Bennett from the MDC, and also in Johannesburg is David Monye, an independent political analyst. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. Roy Bennett, if I can come back to you. After the initial vote, Morgan Tsvangirai did and has in the past very much sought to shore up international support, not just Britain, but other countries as well. Does that lend any weight, I guess, to Robert Mugabe's argument that he is, well, in Robert Mugabe's words, a puppet of the West or of Britain?
I don't think that's correct at all. I think after the last election, President Tsvangirai toured the African region and spoke to African leaders. He never went anywhere near the West or the international community. The issues in Zimbabwe has got absolutely nothing to do about the West or Britain. It's an issue of transfer of power. It's an issue of a despotic, rogue regime that does not want to accept the fact that it has lost the popular support of the people.
But he leans on them a lot. I mean, maybe because of what he feels, how bad the situation is in Zimbabwe, he leans on the international community, not very much looks for their support when this is a Zimbabwean issue.
As I said to you early on, the issue in Zimbabwe was SADC, the intervention of SADC after the beating of the MDC leader on the 11th of March. Is what brought about SADC into this crisis, and President Mbeki being appointed as a mediator. They've handled this crisis and assured the people of Zimbabwe they would have a free and fair election in which that outcome would be uncontested. I don't see the West or Britain or anybody in there. If Britain or the West or any other country wants to make statements around democracy and around decency and in support of the people of Zimbabwe who have been brutalized and terrorized, it's most welcome. It's most welcome for any God-fearing country to stand up and support people that have been brutalized and subjected to terror from a despot that wants to hold on to power at all costs.
Let's just pause for a moment because I want to have a little listen, everyone to have a listen and watch a sound grab from President Robert Mugabe from one of his campaign speeches. Let's have a look at that and we'll talk about it afterwards.
They can shout as loud as they like from Washington or from London or from any other quarter. Our people, only our people will decide and no one else.
So he's talking about the Zimbabwean people, our people, but always invoking Britain and Washington. George Shire in London. Sometimes when you listen to Robert Mugabe, it's almost like it's Robert Mugabe versus Britain rather than Mugabe versus Morgan Tsvangirai. Why is there still this fixation on Britain?
I live in Britain and have done so many times. If you live in Britain as I do, you would think, politicians in Britain sometimes use the name Zimbabwe as a way of frightening their children to go to bed. You would think Zimbabwe was a department of Britain. The amount of newsprint, the amount of radio, the amount of every single day relentlessly, you would think somehow there is some kind of electoral mileage in Britain for the way in which Zimbabwe is discussed by British politicians. That's the first. The second thing, there is not even any in-depth analysis or understanding what the MDC stands for, or what ZANU-PF stands for that matter, or what the choices people face on a day-to-day, what the practical business of it going from. What you get in British public, in the British press, is a serious disinformation. That means that people's understanding of what's going on in Zimbabwe, one way or the other, is seriously distorted. And that's the first. The second thing is many institutions in Britain have been funding the MDC. It's not a secret of that sort. They've been either doing that morally or financially or otherwise. And they give succor to the kind of language and descriptors that the MDC, without even checking one or the other. So in that context, you might understand why they draw the rage from ZANU-PF.
But what is it that ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe actually fear from Britain? I mean, is it a fear that if Morgan Tsvangirai was to win the election, just one moment, is it a fear that if Morgan Tsvangirai was to win this election, MDC was to win an election, that suddenly there'd be British and white people flooding back into Zimbabwe? Is that what he's fearing?
That's too simplistic. Let's start in another way. If you ask yourself about the kind of ideas, policies that drive the MDC, they lock into what I would call a neoliberal, neoconservative ethos, which is identical to the center-right project that is taking place in the West. Their alliance is around the picture they give, and that is the MDC belongs to this network of liberal organizations in Africa and the rest of the world, which is very different from the kind of network that all those political parties that grew out of national liberation movements do. They share a political vision of the world which is neoliberal. So it is not surprising, it is not surprising they sing from the same hymn sheet. Colonialism is not something of the past, it is something of the present. And to understand something of the present, you understand it in and through the panaceas, the solutions the MDC themselves say they will bring into Zimbabwe. That's where the connection lies.
So colonialism is something of the present. Roy Bennett in Johannesburg, what do you make of that?
There must be something very special about Zimbabwe. Let's look at Africa as a whole. How many countries were colonized? So what is so special about Zimbabwe that Britain wants Zimbabwe back, or that Britain's got anything to do with Zimbabwe? Absolute hogwash. The issues in Zimbabwe are issues around a despotic regime that does not want to accept the fact that has lost the popular support of the people of Zimbabwe. Those are the real issues. People being killed, 86 people killed, hundreds of thousands of people homeless, thousands of people hospitalized. Absolute fact. The facts are there on the ground. George Shiri is a known ZANU-PF apologist. He's living in the comfort of England. He's living in the luxury of England, of the very country he is downing, yet he's living off their luxury. Why doesn't he go back to Zimbabwe and enter the war zone where people are being brutalized and killed, where women are having their breasts cut off, their arms and legs cut off, those parts burnt in fires? George Shiri, get back to Zimbabwe and talk from the truth. Don't sit in the luxury of Britain and castigate people that are being brutalized and beaten.
Okay, Roy Bennett, let's hear very briefly,
Bennett,
George Shiri.
I'm sorry to the producer. I think this is personal about me. Let me just kind of respond exactly the point I was making. The argument between the Zimbabwean government and the British government has nothing to do with the relationship between British people and Zimbabwean people. It has nothing to do, the Zimbabwean government is not the same as the Zimbabwean people. A British government is not the same as the British people. I was asked for my opinion as to analyze what I see. And all I'm saying is that the relationship between Britain, particularly New Labour, and the Zimbabwean government has become so fraught to the extent that you cannot distinguish between what the New Labour does and what the MDC does.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt at this point because I'd like to bring back David Monye into the discussion, who's been waiting patiently over in Johannesburg. I'd like to look at another thing, because we've been talking a lot about Britain. Let's broaden it out a bit. You're there in South Africa. Many people look at South Africa, at Thabo Mbeki, as the one force who could really do something, who've really got some leverage, and they aren't doing enough. Is that a fair accusation?
I think the only problem that I have with the obsession with President Mbeki, the individual, is that it lacks a clear collective understanding that President Mbeki is operating within a SADC framework. I think all what he's supposed to do is to negotiate on behalf of fellow head of states in the region as well as the continent to move Zimbabwe ahead. However, behind this obsession with President Thabo Mbeki is the idea that South Africa is a regional power, and therefore it can use its military, it can use its relatively strong economy to really hamstrung and really deal with President Robert Mugabe in a forceful way. I think that is one of the desired kind of outcome of the process. And some of us are saying that can never work.
So who do you think?
The apartheid South Africa.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. Who do you think then could make an impact as a mediator, as a broker? Is there someone you think could do that?
I think President Mbeki or any other leader in the region could do it, provided that the international community, especially powerful countries, their intervention in the region should help aid democracy, it should aid the negotiations. And by that I mean pushing both parties, ZANU-PF and MDC, to negotiate instead of grandstanding and using multilateral institutions and the media in a way of arm-twisting South African government or any other African leaders on issue of Zimbabwe, not understanding the historical elements of Zimbabwean crisis.
Gentlemen, it's been a lively debate. That's what we like here on Inside Story. Thanks for joining us. My thanks to George Shire in London, who is a political analyst there. Also Roy Bennett from the MDC in Johannesburg, and David Monnier, an independent political analyst in Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And thank you, our viewers, so much for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and your suggestions. You can email them to the address on your screen at insidestory@aljazeera.net. The latest on the program is at our website, of course, aljazeera.net/English. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again.